Hey, this is Guy from New Plastic, and today we'll finally go over the most important aspect of CG, lighting. This will be part 1 of a series of light tutorials where we start with the basics of Octane lights, and in the next videos we'll go into how to create light setups like in the real world and how to achieve specific moods using our light setup. If you want to support the channel, you can do so on Patreon, where you'll get access to the tutorial project files, my own personal project files, free products, and most importantly, you'll help me make more and better content. Follow me on Instagram at ojang, subscribe, share, comment, hit the bell, moisturize your skin. Let's go. Leonardo da Vinci said that all things in nature are dark, except we're exposed to light. I actually don't know if he really said it, but the point is that light is everything. It's how we see, what we see, why we see, and how we feel. In my opinion, it's the most important thing in CG. Without it, your best models will look just okay, and your best materials will look bad. Understanding and controlling light in your scene is what separates cool work from amazing work. And the first step in controlling your light is realizing it has nothing to do with CG and everything to do with photography. When I first started picking up CG, I would spend hours watching photography and cinematography tutorials specifically about lighting, and I advise you to do the same. That's why it took me so long to produce this tutorial series. I didn't want it to be just like a technical overview of Cinema 4D and Octane lighting. That's not going to help you create beautiful images. Go and listen to cinematography channels. Some of my favorites are Studio Binder, In-Depth Cine, Cinema Cartography. Listen to the best cinematographers and directors of photography like Roger Deakins, Robert Yeoman, Mihai Malamare, and what they have to say about lighting. Look at paintings and read about the artist's techniques. That's the best way, in my opinion, to get better control of your visual work. A good way to start thinking about lighting a scene is to change the how into what. What's happening in the scene? What mood do I want to capture? What feeling do I want to convey? Simply put, you want to have motivation in your lighting. There's always a story, even in the simplest scenes, and you're telling that story with your lighting. While painters use paint to create a scene, you're painting it with lights. It's not something you use to only show your subject. It's a narrative tool, just like your models, animations, and materials are. There are a few elements to how light affects your scene. The amount of light sources, the direction of your lights, the size of your lights, the colors of your lights. I'm going to start the series with going over some technical aspects of lighting, but I'm going to focus on mood and how to achieve this mood. And on the way, we're going to learn the technicals of lighting, both generally and specifically in Cinema 4D and Octane. I don't want to get too hung up on technicals because those are just tools, and I really like what Roger Deakins, one of the greatest directors of photography of our time, says, and I paraphrase, you don't want to get enslaved to your technicalities. You want to feel what's right for a scene and work with an emotional goal in your mind. The technicalities are a useful tool to help you get there, but focusing on them too much can distract you from the real goal. Still, it's important to know your tools so you understand what to do in order to get where you want to get. So let's start with some Octane light basics. I have this simple scene here with this corner and these simple geometries. I have a metallic, specular, and diffuse materials on them. So in the render view, you can see that it's all grayed out and ugly, which brings me to the first important thing when working with lights. If you go to your Octane settings, first of all, I'm always on path tracing kernel. Honestly, I never even bother with other kernels. Path tracing is perfect for everything I need, and most of these settings don't affect the lighting except the depth settings and GI clamp. Basically, the higher the depth number is, the more light bounces will hit the diffuse or specular channel, which will basically help make them brighter. Same for the GI clamp, which refers to the overall light bounces in your scene. You can see the effect higher numbers have. Try not to go too high because it'll increase your render times. I'll leave a link in the description to a really good explanation that goes into details about all of these settings. Definitely worth a read. But to get rid of that ugly gray render, you want to go to the settings tab, then to the environment tab, and change this color to black. This color here will set an ambient light to your renders that will affect your lights and shadows and will kill your overall contrast. The default in Octane is set to gray for some reason, so unless you have a really good reason not to, always change it to black. Cool, so let's go to the objects menu from the render view. And from here you can add all sorts of different lights. We'll go over most of them, but the most important one and common one is the area light. Now an Octane light is basically a Cinema 4D light with an Octane light tag on it. If you click on the light object, you can see that you have all the general Cinema 4D tabs here. None of them really matter to us except in the details tab, the area shape and the size. You can change the area size here or you can use the scale tool. And you can also change the area shape to all these different shapes that affect how the light acts. Let me just turn around this light and place it in a better place so we can see it better, and just make it weaker real quick. So you can see how the reflections of the rectangle light look. If I change the shape to disc, you get this round light shape, and it kind of makes the edges of the light more soft and the overall light less strong since there's less surface area. But mostly you can see how it affects the reflections, makes them more soft and clean. I use this shape a lot. Another light that's useful is the sphere light, which creates this omnidirectional light that goes all around the light object. It's more like a light bulb and super useful for certain cases. The disc and rectangle only project to one direction in a 180 degrees kind of spread, but sphere will just shoot the light all around it. And the same goes for cube or cylinder. They take those forms and project the light omnidirectionally. I don't use them as much though. I guess this one you can use as a fluorescent light type thing if you make it very long and thin. But yeah, disc and rectangle are my favorite. Okay, so if I select the Octane Light tag, I get the Octane Light options. The first one is the power settings, which acts as the wattage settings. The default is 100 watts, so it acts like a real-life 100 watts bulb. I can play around with the wattage to get stronger or weaker lights. Temperature reflects the real-life light temperature measured in Kelvin, or K. You can Google the Kelvin temperature light chart. It's a very standard chart that I'm sure you've seen when buying light bulbs for your house. The lower the temperature gets, the warmer or redder the light gets. The higher the temperature, the cooler or bluer the light gets. Neutral bright white is between 5500 to 6500. In the texture channel, you can input any kind of color or image to affect your light color. Make sure you go to the Octane menu, otherwise it won't work as expected. And you can add an RGB spectrum node, change it to green, and now this color will be kind of mixed with the light temperature. So if I reduce the temperature, you can see that the green is getting warmer and more yellowish. And if I bring the temperature up, it gets more bluer tone and cooler. And between 5500 and 6500, it keeps the color pretty neutral. I can also add an image texture node, and I added this kind of pink watercolor swirls image. And if you do that, just make sure you add a projection node and set it to either perspective, spherical, or XYZ to UVW. This way the image will stick to the light when you move and rotate the light. You'll see why it's important more clearly in a second. Okay, let's clear this out and move to the distribution channel where you can input a black and white image to control in detail what parts of the area lights are turned on and what parts are blocked off. In photography, this is known as gobo or cookies. So if I add an Octane noise texture, for example, and let's click on it to increase the contrast, and you can see that now the light is blocked on the black areas of the noise. I can play with the details of the noise to get the look that I want. And you can see that if I rotate the light object, the noise doesn't move with it. It kind of sticks to the world space, which is why it's important to add a projection node. I use XYZ to UVW, but spherical and perspective work as well. Now the noise will stick to the object as I move it around. And with the projection node, I can scale the noise, I can move it around. And in the new Octane versions, they added the Cinema 4D noises as procedural noises, finally. So I can have all these unique types of noises to play with. I like fire or hammer, and you can see the different effect it has. And if I add a projection node again, I can also loop the movement of the noise by going to the X rotation, for example, keyframing it 0 degrees at frame 0, and then go into my last frame and keyframing 360 degrees, which will complete a full spin and get back to its original orientation. And you can see now that the noise is moving and creates a perfect loop, which I always love when I can create a looping animation. Now, another thing to note is that the distribution channel gets sharper and higher contrast the smaller the light area is. So if I scale down the light, I'll get more contrast from the light noise. However, you can see that our light also gets weaker the smaller it is. If I increase the power, you can see how many more details we get from the distribution, but now the light power is set to 2000, which is a really high number. So, a way to fix that is to uncheck the surface brightness. If the surface brightness is checked, the light power is connected to the light size. So the smaller the light is, the weaker it is. And the bigger it is, the stronger the light gets. However, when surface brightness is unchecked, the light power will only be affected by the power settings and not by the scale. And if I clear the distribution, it'll be easier to see that without surface brightness, scaling the light doesn't affect its strength. But when it's checked, it gets weaker and stronger as I scale it. Keep instance power doesn't really affect light objects, but has to do more with geometry that has light. So it doesn't really matter here. Double-sided will make your area lights cast light from both sides of the surface. If I rotate and center the light here, you can see how now both objects are lit up from either side. And of course, this would be more effective on rectangle or disc light shapes as they are by default unidirectional. The Normalize setting is related to the light temperature. When Normalize is checked, the light will keep a consistent luminosity strength in either warmer or cooler temperatures. It'll project about the same amount of light. However, when Normalize is unchecked, the light will get darker as the temperature gets lower, so you would have to increase the strength manually when working with lower temperatures, which is actually more physically accurate since warmer lights feel less bright than blue light. That's why computer screens and offices, for example, have a lot of blue light. It feels more bright at lower wattage, so it's more efficient. I always keep Normalize checked. In sample rate, you can assign specific sample amounts for different lights. Let me duplicate this light and place it closer to the specular pyramid. Now this light is lighting the pyramid more prominently, and we can see that the pyramid is pretty noisy. If I keep the top light at 1 sample and increase the sample rate of the bottom light to something extreme like 10,000, and we compare it to the bottom at 1 sample and the top at 1,000, both of these images are fully rendered at overall 512 samples, and you can clearly see how when the top light is set to higher samples, it's casting a much cleaner light. There's practically no noise on the wall, and the pyramid is kinda noisy. But when the bottom light has more samples, all this top light is noisier, and the pyramid is a slightly bit cleaner, not that much cleaner because it's glass and also because it's being lit up a little bit by the top light still. But yeah, a way to think about it is if one light has higher samples, takes away samples from the other lights in the scene out of the overall samples the scene has. So it's kind of a balance between all the lights you need to keep. Okay, let's get rid of this light and bring this one back to 1 sample. Just move it closer to the objects. If you uncheck visible on diffuse, the light will only show on the specular channels of the materials. If visible on specular is unchecked, the light won't reflect on the specular channels and only will show on the diffuse. You can see some of the reflections from other objects, but not the light itself. If cast shadows is unchecked, the light won't cast shadows, and you'll still have shaded areas where the light doesn't hit, but it won't cast shadows off the object it's lighting. Transparent emission only affects geometries with emission, so it's irrelevant for light objects. Use light color removes the texture option and solely uses the temperature for coloring the light. Opacity controls the opacity of the light object itself, not the light it casts. So if I turn it down, the light is still casting, but the light object is hidden from camera, which is extremely useful and is one of the perks of working in CG. You can place the lights wherever you want and not really worry about the light showing in the camera. Another thing to know about the opacity is that if it's turned to 0, light coming from other sources in your scene will not be obstructed by your light object. It'll be easier to see if I turn down the first light's power all the way down. You can see that the object itself is blocking the light from the other light source and casting this shadow. But turning the opacity all the way down will make the light go all the way through it while still being able to cast light. Okay, let's undo all that and delete this light. Now, with LightPass ID, you can assign different ID numbers to your light object. So if I make this light ID 2, I can then add an Octane tag to an object, go to the Object Layer tab, down here and use LightPass mark, change it to enabled, and now I can tick off the light ID I assigned and basically make this object not be affected by the specific light. I rarely use this option, but it's good to know it's here in some rare cases. Also, by assigning different IDs to different lights, you can render passes of those specific lights and use them in post. So the next tab we have is the visibility tab, and that's just another way to control the light visibility. Camera visibility hides the light object from the camera while still casting its light. However, when you do this, it will still block other lights in the scene and cast shadows, unlike the opacity. To avoid that, you can also uncheck shadow visibility. With these two unchecked, it's pretty much like turning the opacity all the way down. And the general visibility is again doing the same thing as turning down the opacity. If we go to the main tab, we have the option to turn this light into an IES light. You can also add an IES light directly from the Objects menu in the Live Viewer. If you turn the light into an IES light, Octane will automatically add an image texture to the distribution channel that already has a projection node. It's set as spherical, but again, you can set it to XYZ to UVW or perspective. Now you have the option to add an IES file here, which is a file that contains information of light distribution of real-life light bulbs that actually exist. You can Google IES lights and find many different free IES files out there, whether from light manufacturers or other sources. You can preview the different distribution each file has and add the one you like. One important thing to note is that the scale of your light affects how the IES looks. So you want to make the light object about the size of a real-life light bulb. And if I place it right on the walls, you can see how it looks. I can turn off surface brightness to compensate for the small scale and turn down the power. And if I compare this to light without the IES information, you can see the crazy difference it has. Without it, the light just spreads about equally across all 180 degrees, but the IES light really focuses and spreads in a specific way. And let's add a different IES light that has more of a spotlight distribution, and again you can tell how different it is. And now we basically made a spotlight out of this area light. I can scale the light to increase the spread of the spot, and since surface brightness is checked, I'll need to increase the power to make it stronger. So yeah, that's really cool. One thing I like to do is to add a null object, place it where I want the light to focus on, then right click on the light object, go to animation tags, then choose target. Now I can drag the null object to the target tag, and the light will now always point to where the null object is. So I can move around the target and have the light orient itself towards it, or move around the light object and have it always orient itself to the target. That's extremely useful. You can also just go to the object menu and add a target light directly from there, which will automatically add a light object with a target tag on it, targeted on the object you had selected. Just be aware that the target will always be the axis point of the object. So for example, if you want to focus on the top of the object, you wouldn't be able to unless you move the axis to the top. That's why I just love adding a null object and using that to control that light. Okay, so another light object we can add is a spotlight. This is a Cinema 4D light object that is set to spot type in the general tab. But when you add a spotlight from the Octane objects menu, it also automatically adds a scattering medium in the Octane tag, where instead of a distribution channel, there's now a light medium channel. What that does is essentially make this light cone visible, as if there's dust in the air catching the light. And of course, you can rotate the light to expose different objects in the scene, or better yet, set a light target and use that to focus on different objects. Another difference from the area light tag is these barn doors, those 4 flaps around the light. You can see that if you open them all the way up, there is more ambient light spilling out on the scene, and if you bring them in tight, you can see the cone getting kind of cut off the edges in this square shape. You can also just disable them if you want. If you want to control the cone size itself, click on the light object, go to the details tab, and here you can control the outer perimeter of the cone where the light completely fades away, and the inner parameter where the light is mostly concentrated. You can see there is this gradual fall off between the inner cone and the outer cone. The bigger the difference is between the cones, the bigger the fall off will be. The aspect ratio stretches out the cone into a more of an ellipse shape, but it doesn't really work in the render view. Okay, so last light object I want to show you is the sunlight. When you add a sunlight, you'll see this vertical line that represents the direction of the sun. If I move around the scene, you can see we have the sky with the sun, and because the direction is a flat 180 degrees, the sun is basically setting on the horizon. If I start rotating the object, the sun will start to rise up and the whole color spectrum of the system will change too. As the sun sets, sky gets darker and sun gets redder. As the sun rises, sky gets brighter and sun gets more white. If the object is at more than 180 degrees, then the sun is out of the scene as it completely set. You can see that the shadows are also affected and get more stretched as the sun sets. In the sun object, we have a few settings, and let me just change the direction so we can see better. The sky turbidity basically makes the sky cloudier, so the light is more diffused and the shadows are less strong and more blurry. The power increases the overall luminosity of the sun and the sky together. The sun intensity only increases the power of the sunlight, not affecting the lights coming from the sky. North offset rotates the sun on its y-axis, so we get light from different directions. You can obviously also do it by rotating the object on the y-axis. Increasing the sun size won't affect the way the sun looks in reflections, but it will make the shadows more soft and diffuse since the light source gets bigger. The bigger the sun, the softer the shadows. The smaller the sun, the harder the shadows. Now you can change the sky color, and I like to sometimes set the sky as black, so we basically don't have any ambient light from the sky and we'll only get light from the sun as a light source. And I can also change the color of the sun and use it kind of like a very strong and infinite spotlight. One quick thing to note is that moving the light object around won't affect the light, only rotating it, since this is like a quote-unquote infinite light. What I like to do sometimes if I'm going for more of a night scene is make the sun a light bluish color and make the sky a dark blue and bring down some of the settings to get more of a moonlight look. Obviously you can further darken the scene in post. So the last thing as far as light settings go is if you go to the Octane settings, in Camera Imager tab, you can control the exposure of the camera, where you basically increase the amount of light the camera registers. As you raise the exposure, brighter objects will get brighter faster. In the gamma, you can basically make the darker areas brighter or darker, kind of playing with the overall contrast of the scene. You can see that if I bring down the gamma, the brighter parts keep their luminosity more than the shadows, which get darker faster. I barely use gamma here, but sometimes I do, and I can always just do it in post. By increasing the highlight compression, I can limit the amount of brightness the scene gets, which can help if there are some parts that are way too bright and the information gets burnt. If I increase the exposure way up, you can see that without the highlight compression, certain areas lose details, but once I increase the compression, we get those details back. If you do that, just make sure that in the render settings, you set your color space to sRGB. Otherwise, your final renders won't have compressed highlights. If your renders are set at linear, they will look like this, even if you have highlight compression on. Another thing to note here is the white point, which is basically what white balance is in regular cameras. Let's say I have some lights that shift the color spectrum of the scene to be a certain color. I can click on the picker tool and pick the white parts in the scene and to balance it out. If that's not enough, I can click on the color and increase the saturation. And you can see that the scene is now much more neutral. The more saturated the white point color is, the more it will compensate for the color shift from the lights in the scene. If it's too saturated, it'll start to overcompensate and color the scene in its opposite color. Now here I can increase the saturation of the image or add a vignette, which I honestly never use and I just do it in post. I can bring down the hot pixel remover to remove fireflies in the scene. There's many tutorials on that, so I'm not going to go into explaining that now. But all these settings are happening after the scene is rendered. As you see, the image is not being re-rendered every time I change these camera imager settings, so you can always just do them in your post-editing software. The last thing is the post effects. If I enable it, and let me just make the background black to get more contrast. And why is it not showing anything? Everything is good on the light tag. I think it's because the background is too black and not reflecting any of the light back. So let's make it just a very dark gray. Yes, now we can see. So if I enable the post effects, we get the notorious bloom effect, where light areas bleed into their surroundings, creating this fuzzy glow effect. I can increase the cutoff, which is basically the threshold of how bright the area can be before it starts glowing. So now you can see not the whole scene is glowing, only the brighter parts. And I can apply a glare effect, increasing the amount of ray in the glare, the rotation, the blurriness, and also introduce a spectral effect to the glow, which makes the glow happen only to specific light frequencies, creating this iridescent glow. And here I can shift the colors of the glow. The interesting thing about the bloom effect is that in the real world, it's mainly considered a flaw. It happens because the light sensor gets bombarded with way too much information and starts to bleed the light into the surrounding pixels. It's something that photographers usually try to avoid so they can get a more crisp and cleaner photo. But in the 3D world, everything is crisp and perfect and clean. We usually want to introduce real-life defects to get rid of some of the perfection CG has, to make it feel more organic and real. That's the reason I think the bloom effect is so loved by CG artists, and it does add a sense of realism and kind of charm to the image, but I would suggest to try and not overuse it. A little goes a long way, and if your image looks good without it, you probably don't need it. If your image doesn't look good without it, try and go back to the image and just make it look better. But it could look better how? Well, that's what we're going to do in the next video, where we'll explore how to light a subject like in real life, different technical terms and techniques from real photography, so you can have a better and clearer idea of how to create our light setup for our specific needs. I want to blow 1,000 kisses to my most spectacular patrons and members: Yin Gong, Guillaume Lopez, The Great Wanderer Studios, Dave Toro, Celia Lopez, Nob, Marie Robbins, Svoyas Chari, Aryaman Munish, Tezijing, Kim Doyon, Wei Kai Zhang, Eric Hu, Elisa, Invader, Daniel Larry, Anthony Gargas, Thomas, Chawan, Beta Mai, Minky Kim, Zoen, Unica, Howard Murik, Average CPU, Anthony Tedisco, Evstatios Panay, Elad, 3D Monkey Biz, Chris Schultz, Arlen, Kiki Lem, Suki Violet Su, The 22 Design, Joel Rieger, Adrian Desolé, Studi Image, Matus Jidrzejewski, Vasco Gross, Blue Hamill, Mark Cragen, Arkady Ulitsky, Fausto Furioso, Joshua Akoy, Xiaohui Ding, Zeming Wang, Punksakornim Siri, Ollie M, Webb, Kong Idiot, Derek Schultz, Nicolas Federico Vasquez, Matti de Gueldre, Anjung, Eniosta, Sigurd Yimud, and everybody else on the list. Thank you so much for the support. I hope you have a great day. I love you. Peace.